Hi, everybody. It's Miss Corbett here. It's about noon on Tuesday, September 22nd. I finished working through the QDS work for Module 5, and so I wanted to say just a few things about what we did and then talk about what's coming next. In Module 5, we read short stories that largely illustrated Golden Age style, though with their own variations and differences. But before I share some thoughts on these stories themselves, I want to take a quick look at the distinctions between the genres of novel and short stories. We're getting a little mixed up on the terminology with those, so let's lay them out and talk about what they mean. What are the implications for these differences? All right, so first of all, we know that novels are full-length works that stand alone, when short stories are shorter, right? They are typically part of a collection or might be published in a journal or a magazine. There's a word count difference. That's definitely true. Novels tend to be we kind of mark it as anything over 50,000 words, while short stories are no longer than 20,000 words. What falls in between is typically thought of as a novella, which is, it's kind of a rare genre format simply because of the difficulty of selling it. But most things are either novels or short stories. So length is the built-in difference between the two. Novels also tend to, and many of these things are things that tend to be true, but are not always. Novels tend to be slower paced because the length allows for more downtime, more scenes where maybe everything big isn't happening. When short stories, they have to be pretty quickly paced. We don't have a lot of downtime. There aren't a lot of scenes that aren't contributing to the outcome of the story. There are going to be more ups and downs with most novels, maybe more rising action, maybe more than one climax. So you'll have one big event happen that changes everything, and then you'll have another kind of up that arc, rising action, and then another climax. When short stories tend to have only one climax, and some parts of the narrative arc might even be missing. You might not have much exposition at the beginning of the story. You might not even have a resolution at the end. You might have just fewer of the beats that we usually see in a narrative. Novels tend to cover longer time spans and more settings, go to more locations, while short stories tend to be limited in settings and time span. There are often multiple subplots in a novel. You've got your main thing going on, like who killed Roger Ackroyd, but then you also have these side things going on, like Flora and Hector Blunt falling in love, that kind of thing. That's a subplot. That's a side story. When with short stories, you're going to have few or maybe even no subplots. Crime novels, detective stories, can have more complex crimes and solutions, more red herrings. As we noted in at least The Venom of the Tarantula that we read this week, they might be simpler solutions, and the investigation process might be pretty straightforward. There's just not as much space for that much complexity. The writer John Dickinson Carr, he was a master of the locked room style of mystery. The Venom of the Tarantula was a locked room mystery. Now, just to be clear, locked room is not the same thing as a closed setting. Closed setting means that there's a limited number of suspects. Locked room means that there is apparently no way for it to have been committed, the crime to have been committed. So like if someone dies in a room that's locked from the inside and there's no way in or out and they're found alone, then it seems impossible. Now, how could someone have committed this murder? How did they get out of the room? That's a locked room story. So closed setting is just a limited number of suspects. So John Dickinson Carr was the master of the locked room style. And he once stated that the short story, not the novel, was the ideal genre for detective literature because it required tighter plotting and fewer subplots, which he says takes away from the purity of the mystery. I'll leave it for you to decide if you agree with him. This last week, you got to weigh in on some of the distinctions and similarities between these stories that we read and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd in our reading journals. Just a couple of reminders about the reading journals. Be specific. Stick to one of the prompts. We pick one prompt for each story in this case. And just make sure you're developing to word count requirements. I really enjoyed reading your responses and was happy to see you were touching on some compelling distinctions, such as structure or interpretations of what qualifies as fair play in these stories. For each of the stories we read this week, I'm left with a few points that I want to consider. So let's talk about them. The Swedish match, also known as the safety match, those are interchangeable titles. They're just translation differences. This story is a parody, as we mentioned. It's an imitation that uses exaggeration for comic effect. So, like Austin Powers, the Scary Movie franchise, all those kinds of things are parodies. Chekhov is criticizing the genre in a way through this story. He gives us bumbling detectives who jump to conclusions based on nothing but circumstantial evidence. The explanations get outlandish, unbelievable, and the murder doesn't even end up being a murder. Though Chekhov wrote this story before the murder of Roger Ackroyd, he was parodying the same texts that led to this book, such as The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which we read at the beginning of the semester. The fact that he wrote this parody in the late 19th century shows us the crazy popularity of this genre. In a matter of decades, the stories had become pervasive enough that even in Russia, they were sufficiently well known to be the target of parody on behalf of one of the most famous writers at the time. There's also the Venom of the Tarantula. As we learned in the video, Bandyopadhyay had a tendency to write about social issues he saw in Calcutta, while Christie didn't really care much about those social issues. She touched on cocaine use, for instance, but it wasn't a big factor in the novel ultimately. As our prompts mentioned, our potential victim isn't very likable in this story, and the crime isn't necessarily even a crime. Both elements contribute to the sense of this story as a puzzle, more like a math problem to be solved, doing away with any investment we might really have in the characters themselves. Plot here, the puzzle, is all that's really there to engage us. So it's really Golden Age style and the Golden Age focus on plot to the nth degree, to the most. The potential victim's lack of likability, though some of us mentioned we did kind of like the guy, but his overall kind of lack of warm and fuzzies also makes me think about the American tradition of detective stories, up to and including contemporary stories. I think if we looked at a broad range of contemporary American crime stories, we'd find that our victims do tend to be likable and often vulnerable in some way. Women and children make up the vast majority of victims. Indeed, that's so true that across many cultures, that's so true that there's now even an international contest for murder mysteries in which no woman is raped, beaten, or murdered, or stalked. It's so rare to find those that there's whole kind of world sprouting out saying, okay, we're going to stop doing that to women in our stories. A lot has been written about this trend, whether it be the product of misogyny or attempts to be shocking or scandalous. But I point this out because as we move forward, I want us to think more about the choice of victim. What, if anything, can we learn about a culture or time period by the common types of victims? Finally, we read The Puzzle of the Broken Watch. One aspect of this story that stands out to me and to a lot of you is the focus on lower socioeconomic class. As quite a few of you noted, Golden Age stories tend to involve the upper classes, but we can see how a few decades later, writers had shifted focus even in this same style. We'll learn a bit about why this happened next week as we start talking about hard-boiled detective stories, but we're seeing the shift already in detective literature, in that detective literature is starting to care more about people of lower socioeconomic classes. It's worth noting as well that the police in this story appear to care very little about these people. They find someone to pin the murder on and then they're done. Perhaps it's just that they're incompetent, like the police in the murder of Roger Ackroyd, but I think it's more that they don't value these people or this case very much. We're already seeing the justice system and the public safety efforts not really prioritizing people of lower socioeconomic classes. Already, we're starting to see the start of a relatively recent trend in detective literature, one that will come into more popularity in police procedurals, and that's of smart detectives helping the little man, not just the rich and powerful. Though first, we need to go through the hard-boiled style, which I'll say more about in a minute. In Module 5, you also submitted your critical literary analyses, which I'm excited to dive into. I will be reading and commenting on these over the next few days. I'll post an announcement once I've finished reviewing them and telling you where to find my comments and all that kind of stuff. I expect that to be by the end of the weekend or so. I'll let you know if it ends up being longer than that. All right, let's transition to peeking at what's coming next in Module 6. Module 6 marks the beginning of Unit 2, when we're moving away from Golden Age stories to consider a few different styles of detective fiction that have dominated the last 75 years or so. This week, we're going to learn about one, which is hard-boiled detective literature, a heavily American genre. We're going to focus on it this week and then next week a little bit as we shift into looking at film as literature. But we can't spend as much time on it simply because it is such a heavily American genre, though it's not only an American genre. You'll watch a brief video introducing the style, and then you'll read 3 short stories from it. One is from an American-Canadian writer, one's a Brazilian writer, and one is a Sri Lankan writer. You'll get to apply the style characteristics to these stories in the week's discussion board. You'll see the ways in which this style starts to move away from the things we knew to be true in Golden Age. Things like the detective's decalogue don't apply anymore, right? We're going to a whole other style. So we'll start looking at some of the ways those are different. We'll also have a video and journal, your reading journal this week, related to voice and style, topics that are essential to any literary study, but are definitely harder to analyze in translated work. All of our remaining text after this week, or after next week, will be translated texts or subtitled texts. So it'll be a bit trickier to apply some of these things that we're learning this week, but they're still applicable. But we're going to focus on them now. The things about literary flair, looking at writing on a sentence level, the voice and style of it. As always, let me know if you have any questions at all. Again, I'm going to be very excitedly working my way through your critical analyses. Thanks for sharing them, and I'll be getting those back to you as soon as I can. All right, have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye.